knock on the door came at midnight, and Eleanor Whitfield knew before she reached the hallway that her family's world had ended. Her father stood in the study with his hands shaking, a letter crushed in his fist, his face the color of old paper. Eleanor had never seen him look so small. He was a man who filled rooms with his voice, who laughed too loud at his own jokes, who promised everyone that fortune would turn in his favor. That night, fortune had turned its back on him completely. "Father," Eleanor said, stepping into the candlelight. "What has happened?" Edmund Whitfield did not answer at first. He handed her the letter instead, his fingers trembling so badly that the paper shook between them like a leaf caught in wind. Eleanor read it once, then again, because the first reading did not feel real. The debt was enormous. Years of bad investments, of cards played too late into the night, of promises made to men who did not forgive easily, had gathered into a single number that would strip the family of everything: the house, the land, the small dignity that remained to them after years of whispered rumors in the village. All of it would be gone within the month unless the debt was paid in full. "There is no way to raise this sum," her father said, his voice breaking. "I have tried every door. Every friend has turned away. We will lose everything, Eleanor. Your mother, your sister, your brother. I have failed you all." Eleanor's mind moved quickly, the way it always did when the people she loved were in danger. She thought of her mother, whose health had never fully recovered from the birth of her youngest child. She thought of Charlotte, only 15, who dreamed of a proper education and a life free from scandal. She thought of Henry, 12 years old, and already carrying more worry than a boy his age should know. And then her father said the words that changed everything. "There is one man who has offered a solution. The Duke of Ashbourne has expressed interest in a marriage. He is wealthy beyond measure, and his man of business approached me only yesterday, before I knew the full extent of our ruin. I did not take it seriously then. I do now." Eleanor had heard of the Duke of Ashbourne the way everyone in the county had heard of him. He was spoken of in careful tones, as a man who had lost his fiancée in tragic circumstances years before, and had never recovered his warmth afterward. Some called him cold, others called him cruel. No one called him kind. She thought of Peter. Peter Grant, the son of the local physician, had loved her since they were children running through the fields behind her family's house. They had an understanding between them, unspoken but certain, built on years of stolen conversations and letters passed quietly between friends. She had imagined a future with him more times than she could count, a small house, a life without titles or grand estates, but full of warmth. That future disappeared in the space of a single breath. "I will marry the Duke," Eleanor said. Her father looked at her as though she had struck him. "Eleanor, you do not understand what you are agreeing to. This man is not known for gentleness. I have heard stories." "I understand enough," she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. "I understand that Mother cannot survive the shame of losing this house. I understand that Charlotte deserves a future, and Henry deserves a home. I understand that you have exhausted every other option, and this is the only door left open to us." She did not say Peter's name. She did not tell her father what she was giving up, because she knew that if she spoke it aloud, she might lose the courage to go through with the decision at all. Some sacrifices were meant to be carried alone, and this one, she decided in that moment, would be hers alone to bear. The days that followed moved with terrible speed. Her father's man of business met with representatives from Ashbourne Hall, and within a week, the arrangement was settled. The Duke required a wife. Eleanor's family required salvation. The exchange was simple, transactional, and utterly without romance, exactly as such arrangements were meant to be among people of consequence. Eleanor wrote one letter before the wedding, and she wrote it to Peter. She did not tell him the truth of why she was marrying. She could not bear for him to know that her family's ruin had forced her hand, because she feared his pity more than she feared his anger. Instead, she wrote that circumstances had changed, that she wished him happiness, and that their understanding, whatever it had been, must end. She sealed the letter with trembling hands and gave it to a servant to deliver, and she did not allow herself to cry until the servant was gone from sight. Her mother wept when she learned of the engagement, though she did not fully understand the depth of what Eleanor was sacrificing. Charlotte hugged her tightly and whispered that she was the bravest person she had ever known. Henry, too young to grasp the full weight of the situation, simply asked if the Duke had a large library, and Eleanor found herself laughing despite everything, a small broken sound that surprised her as much as it surprised her brother. The wedding day arrived faster than she could prepare her heart for it. Ashbourne Hall rose from the countryside like something out of an old story, its gray stone walls catching the pale morning light, its windows tall and unlit despite the hour. Eleanor arrived in a carriage that felt too grand for a woman who had spent her whole life in a house now facing ruin, and she stepped down onto the gravel drive with her chin lifted, determined not to show the fear churning beneath her calm exterior. The Duke was waiting near the entrance, flanked by his household staff, and Eleanor's first look at him told her everything the rumors had promised, and nothing they had explained. Julian Ashbourne was tall, with dark hair and eyes the color of a winter sky, gray and distant and giving nothing away. He wore his formality like armor, his expression carved from something colder than stone. When he greeted her, his voice was polite but empty, the words of a man performing a duty rather than a man meeting his future wife. "Miss Whitfield," he said, offering a slight bow, "I trust your journey was without difficulty." "It was, Your Grace," Eleanor answered, matching his formal tone, though her heart pounded beneath her composed exterior. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes moving over her face, as though searching for something he expected to find, and did not. Whatever he was looking for, he did not seem to locate it, and his expression settled back into its careful neutrality. "The ceremony will take place this afternoon," he said. "There is no need for elaborate preparation. I am told you understand the nature of this arrangement." "I do, Your Grace." "Then we are agreed." He turned toward the hall's entrance, expecting her to follow, and Eleanor found herself staring at his retreating back, struck by how easily he dismissed the moment that would alter the entire course of her life. To him, this was a transaction concluded. To her, it was the closing of every door she had once hoped to walk through. She followed him inside, past servants who watched her with curious, careful eyes, into a house that smelled of polished wood and old stone, cold despite the warmth of the season. Somewhere in this house, she thought, was the truth of who Julian Ashbourne really was, buried beneath the coldness he wore like a second skin. She did not know yet whether she would ever find it, or whether she even wanted to try. The ceremony that afternoon was brief and quiet, attended by only a handful of witnesses. There was no joy in it, no celebration, only the solemn exchange of vows between two strangers bound together by necessity rather than affection. Eleanor spoke her promises in a steady voice, though her mind kept drifting to the letter she had sent, to the life she had given up without ever explaining why. Julian spoke his vows with the same detached formality he had shown since her arrival, his gray eyes fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder, as though he could not quite bring himself to look at the woman who was now his wife. When the ceremony ended, he offered her his arm out of obligation rather than affection, and Eleanor took it, feeling the cold distance of the man beside her as clearly as she felt the ring now resting on her finger. That night, as she sat alone in the grand bedroom assigned to her, staring out at the darkened grounds of Ashbourne Hall, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since her father's midnight confession, to grieve for everything she had lost. She grieved for Peter, for the simple life she would never have, for the version of herself who might have grown old surrounded by warmth instead of stone walls, and a husband who looked at her like a stranger. But beneath the grief, something else stirred, quiet and unexpected, a question she did not yet have the courage to ask herself fully. Who was the man she had married, truly, beneath the coldness the world had given him? And would she ever find the strength, or the reason, to look for the answer? Outside her window, the wind moved through the trees of Ashbourne's vast grounds, and somewhere in the depths of the house, a door closed with a quiet, final sound. Eleanor closed her eyes and for the first time in weeks allowed herself to simply breathe, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, certain only that there was no path back to the life she had left behind. A soft knock came at her door not long after, and when she opened it, she found an older woman standing in the corridor, a candle in her hand and a guarded kindness in her eyes. She introduced herself as Mrs. Bramwell, the housekeeper, and said she had come to see whether the new Duchess required anything before retiring for the night. Eleanor almost refused out of habit, but something in the woman's careful gaze made her pause. "Has the Duke always been so distant?" she asked before she could stop herself. Mrs. Bramwell hesitated, glancing down the darkened corridor, as though the walls themselves might carry the words further than intended. "His Grace was not always as you see him now, my lady. There was a time, before the tragedy, when this house was full of laughter. I will say no more than that, for it is not my place, but I do not believe the man is gone entirely, only hidden." The words settled into Eleanor's chest like a small ember, fragile and uncertain, yet warm enough to notice. She thanked the housekeeper and closed the door, and for a long while she sat by the window turning the words over in her mind. A tragedy. A man hidden beneath coldness. It was not much, but it was more than she had expected to learn on her first night in this unfamiliar house. She thought again of Peter, of the letter she had sent. of the quiet ache that still lived beneath her ribs whenever she allowed herself to remember him. She wondered if he had received her words yet, and what he had thought of them. She wondered if he hated her, or worse, if he understood nothing at all of the reasons behind her sudden and unexplained retreat. But there was no room now for wondering what might have been. She had made her choice, and her family's future depended on her ability to endure whatever life at Ashbourne Hall required of her. She rose from the window at last, pulled the heavy curtains closed against the darkness outside, and allowed herself finally to sleep. Though her dreams that night were restless and full of gray winter eyes that watched her from a distance she could not cross. Morning at Ashbourne Hall arrived with a silence so complete that Eleanor lay still for several minutes before she remembered where she was. The room was grand, larger than any bedroom she had known in her father's house, yet it felt hollow rather than comfortable, as though no one had truly lived in it for years. She rose and dressed with the help of a young maid named Agnes, who spoke little but watched Eleanor with curious eyes, the way the entire household seemed to watch her, as if waiting to see what kind of duchess she would become. Breakfast was served in a dining room far too large for 2 people. Julian was already seated when she arrived, a newspaper open before him, and he glanced up only briefly to acknowledge her presence before returning his attention to the printed page. "Good morning, Your Grace," Eleanor said, taking her seat. "Good morning," he replied, without looking up again. The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable. Eleanor picked at her food, searching for something to say that might break through the wall he had built around himself, but every attempt at conversation died before it left her lips. Finally, she set down her fork and spoke plainly. "I understand this marriage was not born of affection on either side," she said, "but we are bound to share a life together now, Your Grace. I would rather we find some way to be at ease in each other's company than spend our days in silence." Julian lowered his newspaper slowly, his gray eyes studying her with an expression she could not quite read. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker there, surprise perhaps, or curiosity, before the coldness settled back into place. "You are direct," he said. "I did not expect that. Would you prefer I were not?" "I would prefer," he said, folding his newspaper and setting it aside, "that you understand this house runs on order and routine. I do not require conversation at breakfast. I do not require companionship in the evenings. What I require is a wife who understands her role and does not disturb the peace I have built for myself." The words stung more than Eleanor expected, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "And what is my role, Your Grace, if not to be your wife in more than name? You will manage the household. You will attend the functions that require a duchess at my side. Beyond that, I ask nothing of you, and I offer nothing in return beyond the security this marriage provides your family." He rose from the table, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "I trust that is sufficient." He left the room without waiting for her response, and Eleanor sat alone amid the remains of a breakfast she no longer had any appetite for, staring at the empty doorway through which her husband had disappeared. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Julian spent his mornings in his study, tending to matters of business and estate management, and his afternoons riding across the grounds alone, returning only as evening fell. Eleanor, left largely to her own devices, began to explore the vast house that was now her home, learning its corridors and rooms, its quiet corners and grand halls. She found the library on the 3rd day, a room so full of books that she lost herself within it for hours, running her fingers along worn spines and forgotten titles. It became her refuge, a place where the coldness of the house seemed to soften, where sunlight fell through tall windows and warmed the old wooden floors. It was there, on a quiet afternoon nearly 2 weeks into her marriage, that she first saw a different side of Julian. She had not expected him to enter the library at that hour, and when the door opened and he stepped inside, she nearly dropped the book she was holding in surprise. He stopped short as well, clearly not expecting to find her there, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I did not mean to intrude," Eleanor said, moving to leave. "You are not intruding," Julian said, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. "This library belongs to the house as much as to me. You are welcome here." She hesitated, then gestured to the book in her hands. "I found a volume of poetry. I did not expect to find such a collection in a house that seemed so devoted to order and business." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful stillness he wore like armor. "My mother collected them," he said. "She loved poetry more than any other pursuit. This library was hers before it was mine." "Was?" Eleanor asked gently. "She passed many years ago." His voice grew guarded again, the warmth retreating as quickly as it had appeared. "I do not often speak of her." "I am sorry," Eleanor said. "I did not mean to bring up painful memories." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes moving over the shelves of books surrounding them. "You did not know," he said finally. "There is no fault in that." He moved further into the room, running his fingers along a shelf as though the gesture brought him some quiet comfort. "She used to read to me here, when I was young, before everything changed." Eleanor wanted desperately to ask what he meant by everything changing, but she sensed the fragility of the moment, the way his walls had lowered only slightly and might rise again at the smallest provocation. Instead, she simply said, "I am glad this room remains as she left it. It seems a fitting way to honor her memory." Julian looked at her then, truly looked at her, for the first time since her arrival at Ashbourne Hall. Whatever he saw in her expression seemed to surprise him, and for a moment the coldness in his eyes gave way to something softer, something almost like gratitude. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "you are not entirely what I expected." Before Eleanor could respond, a servant appeared at the library door, informing Julian that a matter of estate business required his immediate attention. He nodded, and the walls rose again, quick and complete, and within moments he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone once more among the books that had briefly connected them. She remained in the library long after he departed, turning the moment over in her mind, searching for meaning in the small cracks she had glimpsed in his armor. It was not much, she told herself. A few words about his mother, a fleeting softness in his eyes, but it was more than she had expected to find in a man the world called cold and cruel, and it left her with a quiet, unexpected hope that perhaps there was more to Julian Ashbourne than the reputation that preceded him. In the days that followed the encounter in the library, Eleanor noticed small changes in Julian's manner toward her, subtle enough that she might have imagined them had she not been watching so closely. He began joining her for breakfast without the newspaper raised between them like a wall. He asked, once or twice, how she found the grounds, or whether the kitchen staff had accommodated her preferences. They were small courtesies, nothing more, yet they felt significant against the backdrop of the coldness that had greeted her upon her arrival. One afternoon she came upon him in the stables, standing beside a tall gray horse that nuzzled at his shoulder with obvious affection. It was the first time she had seen him look entirely at ease, his shoulders loose, his expression unguarded, and she found herself lingering in the doorway rather than announcing her presence immediately. "Her name is Winter," Julian said without turning, somehow aware of her presence despite her silence. "My mother gave her to me the year before she died. She is the only creature in this house who has known me longer than my own reflection." Eleanor stepped further into the stable, drawn by the rare openness in his voice. "She is beautiful. She is stubborn," he said, though there was fondness in the words. "Much like her former owner, I am told." Eleanor smiled, surprised by the small joke, so unexpected from a man she had believed incapable of humor. "I would not have guessed you capable of teasing, Your Grace. There are a great many things about me you have not yet guessed," he said, and though his tone remained even, something in his gray eyes seemed to invite her closer, rather than warn her away. "Perhaps, in time, you will learn some of them." It was the closest he had come to acknowledging that their marriage might become something more than the cold arrangement he had described on that first morning at breakfast. Eleanor did not press further, sensing that such moments were delicate things, easily frightened away by too much attention. But she carried the exchange with her for the rest of the day, turning it over in her mind like a small treasure. That evening she wrote to her sister Charlotte, describing the house in careful detail, the library and its poetry, the stables and the gray horse named Winter, though she said little of Julian himself beyond the barest facts. She could not yet put words to what she was beginning to feel, the strange, cautious hope taking root beneath her ribs, despite every reason she had to guard her heart against it. She had married this man out of necessity, not affection, and she reminded herself of that fact even as she found herself thinking of his rare smile, more often than she cared to admit. Grace Elliott, a childhood friend who had married into a family 2 counties away, wrote back within the week, her letter full of warmth and gentle teasing about the softness Eleanor could not quite hide in her descriptions of the Duke. Eleanor laughed aloud reading it, alone in her room, and for a moment the weight she carried felt lighter, as though sharing even a small piece of her new life with someone who loved her, made the unfamiliar house feel a little less like a cage. But the lightness did not last. The letter was from her mother, and though it began with ordinary news of the household, it ended with a warning that made Eleanor's stomach turn cold. The debt, her mother wrote, had not been fully settled by the marriage arrangement. A portion remained unpaid, and the man to whom it was owed, a merchant named Colton Vane, had grown impatient. He had begun making inquiries about Eleanor's new position as Duchess of Ashbourne, and there were whispers that he intended to use her marriage as leverage to demand a larger sum than originally agreed upon. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling with each pass. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that her sacrifice had been enough, that her marriage had purchased her family's safety in full. Now she understood that the danger had not ended. It had only changed shape, following her into this new life, like a shadow she could not outrun. She could not tell Julian. The thought came to her immediately and with absolute certainty. If he learned that her family's debts remained unresolved, that the marriage he had entered believing it settled a transaction cleanly had, in fact, left loose threads that threatened scandal, he would see it as a betrayal. He would see her as a burden rather than a wife, confirmation of every cold assumption he had made about the necessity of their arrangement. She could not bear for him to look at her that way, not now, not after the small, fragile moment they had shared in the library. She folded the letter carefully and hid it among her belongings, and that evening, when Julian asked if anything troubled her, she offered only a practiced smile and claimed she was simply tired from the day. He studied her for a moment, his gray eyes searching her face with something that might have been suspicion or might have been concern, and then he let the matter drop, retreating once more into the careful distance that defined their marriage. But as Eleanor lay awake that night, staring at the shadows moving across her ceiling, she knew the peace she had begun to find within these cold stone walls was more fragile than she had allowed herself to believe. Colton Vane's threat loomed somewhere beyond the gates of Ashbourne Hall, patient and unrelenting, and she understood with growing dread that the sacrifice she had made to save her family was not yet complete. There would be more to give, more to hide, and more danger to face before this story reached its end. She thought of Peter, briefly, as she often did in her quietest moments, wondering if he had found peace in the wake of her departure, wondering if he ever thought of her at all. But those thoughts, too, she pushed away, because there was no room in her heart now for what might have been. There was only the present danger, the fragile connection growing between herself and a husband who was beginning, slowly and carefully, to let her see beneath his armor, and the debt that still threatened to destroy everything she had sacrificed so much to protect. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little comfort, and Eleanor woke the next morning with a new resolve settling into her chest. Whatever Colton Vane intended, whatever threat he posed to her family and her fragile new life, she would face it alone if she had to. She had already given up everything once to protect the people she loved. She would not hesitate to do so again. A carriage arrived at Ashbourne Hall on a gray afternoon, unannounced and unexpected, and Eleanor's heart stopped when she recognized the man who stepped down from it. Peter Grant stood at the edge of the gravel drive, dressed in traveling clothes still dusted from the road, his eyes searching the grand facade of the house until they found her standing near a window. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had not seen him since the night she sent that final letter, had not allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to stand before him again, and now here he was, close enough to touch, carrying an expression of confusion and hurt that she recognized immediately. She met him in the entrance hall before he could be announced properly to the household, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something achingly close to relief. "Peter," she said quietly, "you should not have come." "I received your letter," he said, his voice tight with emotion he was struggling to control. "You gave me no explanation, Eleanor. Circumstances changed, you wrote, as though years of understanding between us could be dismissed in a single line. I deserved more than that. I deserved to know why." Eleanor glanced anxiously toward the hallway, aware that any servant might overhear, aware that Julian himself might appear at any moment. "This is not the place," she said. "Please, Peter, you must leave before you are seen." "I will not leave until you tell me the truth," he said, and there was a stubbornness in his voice that reminded her painfully of the boy she had grown up beside, the boy who had once promised her a future far different from the one she now lived. "Do you love him? Is that the truth you could not bring yourself to write? Tell me that, and I will leave and trouble you no further." The question struck her like a physical blow, because she did not yet know the honest answer, and the uncertainty of it frightened her more than any lie could have. "It does not matter whether I love him," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am his wife, Peter. That truth cannot be undone, whatever else remains uncertain in my heart. It matters to me," he said, stepping closer. "It should matter to you." "You do not understand the circumstances that led me here," Eleanor said, tears gathering despite her effort to hold them back. "My family faced ruin. My father's debts would have destroyed everything, everyone I love, and this marriage was the only path that offered salvation. I did not choose this because my heart changed toward you. I chose it because I had no other choice that would spare the people I love from disaster." Peter's expression shifted from hurt to something softer, though the pain in his eyes did not fully fade. "Why did you not tell me this? I would have found another way." I would have helped you, Eleanor. You did not have to sacrifice yourself in silence. There was no other way, she said, and I could not bear for you to try and fail, and lose yourself trying to save something that could not be saved by ordinary means. This was the only path, Peter. I am sorry for the pain it has caused you. I never intended to hurt you this deeply. Before Peter could respond, footsteps sounded from the corridor, measured and deliberate, and Eleanor turned to find Julian standing at the entrance to the hall, his gray eyes moving between her and the stranger before him, with an expression she could not read. The warmth she had glimpsed in recent days had vanished entirely, replaced by the cold formality that had greeted her on her wedding day. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I was not aware we were expecting a visitor." "Your Grace," Eleanor said quickly, stepping between the two men as though she could somehow shield them from each other. "This is Peter Grant, a friend from my family's village. He was passing through and stopped to offer his regards." Julian's gaze lingered on Peter for a long moment, something calculating and guarded settling behind his eyes. "A friend," he repeated, the word carrying a weight that made Eleanor's stomach twist with dread. How fortunate that he found the time to visit so far from home. Peter, sensing the tension in the room, offered a stiff bow. "Your Grace, I did not mean to intrude upon your household. I will take my leave." "Please do," Julian said, his voice cold enough that Eleanor flinched at the sound of it. Peter cast one final glance at Eleanor, a look that carried both apology and quiet devastation, and then he turned and left the hall, his footsteps echoing against the stone floor until the sound of the closing door swallowed them completely. Eleanor stood frozen in the silence that followed, painfully aware of Julian's gaze still fixed upon her. "Your Grace," she began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "I do not require an explanation," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite entirely. "You are entitled to your friendships, Duchess. I have no claim over your heart, only your name and your presence at my side when duty requires it. I would ask only that such visits be arranged with proper notice in the future, for the sake of appearances if nothing else." The formality of his words cut deeper than open anger would have, because Eleanor understood now that whatever fragile trust had begun to grow between them in the library and the stables had been damaged by a moment she could not fully explain without revealing truths she was not yet ready to share. She wanted desperately to tell him everything, about Peter, about the understanding they had once shared, about the sacrifice she had made in choosing this marriage over the life she might have had, but the words would not come, caught behind years of instinct that told her some griefs were meant to be carried silently, without burdening those around her. "I understand, Your Grace," she said instead, and watched as he nodded once, sharply, before turning and disappearing back into the depths of the house. That night, dinner passed in a silence colder than any they had shared since her arrival at Ashbourne Hall. Julian barely looked at her across the table, his attention fixed on his plate, his responses to her careful attempts at conversation clipped and distant. Eleanor picked at her food, her appetite gone entirely, grief and frustration warring within her chest. She wanted to explain herself. She wanted to tell him that Peter's visit meant nothing beyond the closing of an old chapter, that whatever she had once felt for him belonged now to a life she could not return to. But every attempt to speak died in her throat, smothered by the fear that explaining Peter would require explaining everything, including the debt that still hung over her family like a blade waiting to fall, and she could not risk Julian learning of that danger now, not when his trust in her already felt so fragile. After dinner, she retreated to the library, seeking the comfort of the room that had once brought her and Julian closer together. She found herself standing among the shelves of poetry that had belonged to his mother, running her fingers along familiar spines, when the door opened behind her and Julian entered, his expression unreadable in the dim evening light. "I did not expect to find you here," he said, echoing the words she had once spoken to him in this same room. "I often come here when I need to think," Eleanor admitted. Julian moved further into the room, stopping a careful distance away, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Who is he, Eleanor? Truly, I saw the way he looked at you. That was not the expression of a mere acquaintance." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, weighing the cost of honesty against the cost of continued silence. "We grew up together," she said finally. "There was an understanding between us. Before my family's circumstances changed, I ended it when I agreed to marry you. I did not tell you because I did not believe it mattered any longer, and because I did not wish to burden you with a grief that was mine alone to carry." Something shifted in Julian's expression, the coldness giving way, briefly, to something more vulnerable. "You gave him up," he said slowly, as though understanding for the first time the true weight of what her marriage had cost her. "For your family's sake." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. And you never told me. I did not think you wished to know the details of a heart you never claimed for yourself, she said, and the honesty of it surprised even her, the words escaping before she could soften them. Our marriage was arranged for practical reasons, Your Grace. I did not believe my private grief was relevant to the transaction. Julian was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her, lost in thought she could not follow. Perhaps, he said finally, I have given you reason to believe your grief does not matter to me. That was not my intention, though I understand now how my conduct might have suggested otherwise. It was as close to an apology as he had offered since her arrival, and Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest at the unexpected admission. Julian, she said, using his given name for the first time, testing the weight of it on her tongue. I do not regret my choice. I want you to understand that. Whatever I gave up, I do not regret the path that brought me here. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for a moment the careful distance between them seemed to shrink to nothing at all. I find myself glad to hear you say so, he said quietly, though I confess I do not fully understand why it matters so much to me that you do. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them, but something had shifted in the quiet library that evening, a fragile understanding forming in the space where coldness had once lived. Eleanor did not yet know what it meant or where it might lead, but she carried the warmth of the moment with her as she returned to her room that night, hopeful for the first time that the marriage she had entered out of desperate necessity might yet become something worth treasuring. Before returning to her room, Eleanor found Mrs. Bramwell in the corridor, carrying a tray of linens toward one of the guest chambers, and something in the older woman's steady presence made Eleanor pause and ask a question that had lingered in her mind since her first night at Ashbourne Hall. Mrs. Bramwell, she said quietly, you mentioned once that a tragedy changed his grace. I do not wish to pry into matters that are not mine to know, but I find myself wondering if understanding might help me be a better wife to him. The housekeeper set down her tray and studied Eleanor for a long moment, as though weighing how much truth the young duchess could bear. It is not my story to tell in full, my lady, she said finally, but I will say this much. Years ago, his grace was engaged to a young woman he loved deeply, before he became duke, before the weight of the title settled upon his shoulders. She died suddenly, of a fever that took her within days, and his grace was at her side when it happened. He has never spoken of it since, not once, not to anyone in this household. But those of us who knew him before understand that the man he was, and the man he has become, are not entirely the same person. Eleanor absorbed the words slowly, feeling a fresh understanding settle over the coldness Julian wore so carefully. He loved her, she said softly. With his whole heart, Mrs. Bramwell confirmed, and when she was taken from him, he closed that heart away, believing perhaps that loving so deeply again would only invite the same grief a second time. I tell you this, my lady, not to burden you, but because I have watched you these past weeks, and I have seen something in his grace that has not appeared since before her passing. A softness, however small. I believe you may be the one who finally coaxes him back into the light, if you are patient enough to try. The words stayed with Eleanor long after Mrs. Bramwell continued on her way, settling into her chest with a weight both hopeful and sorrowful. She understood now the source of Julian's coldness, the careful walls he had built around himself, and rather than diminishing her growing affection for him, the knowledge only deepened it. He was not cruel by nature, she realized. He was a man who had loved once with his whole heart, and had been broken so completely by loss that he had chosen never to risk such devastation again. She thought of her own grief, of Peter and the future she had given up, and found an unexpected kinship in the comparison. They were both, in their own ways, carrying losses they had never fully allowed themselves to voice, both hiding behind careful composure to protect themselves from further pain. Perhaps, she thought, that shared understanding might become the foundation upon which something real could finally grow between them. Lying awake in her room that night, Eleanor allowed her mind to wander back to the years before her marriage, to the long afternoons spent with Peter along the riverbank near her family's estate, to the quiet promises they had exchanged beneath the shade of ancient oak trees. She did not regret those memories, even now, even bound as she was to another man entirely. They had shaped her, taught her what tenderness felt like, and she carried that knowledge forward into her marriage like a quiet gift, hoping that somewhere within her capacity to love gently, she might find a way to reach the guarded heart of the man she had married. But grief for what she had lost could not be allowed to overshadow the fragile hope now taking root in her chest. Julian had looked at her tonight with something close to warmth, had spoken her name for what felt like the first time with genuine feeling, rather than cold formality. Whatever tragedy had shaped him, whatever walls he had built to protect himself from further loss, Eleanor found herself believing, cautiously and quietly, that those walls were not impenetrable. She had seen the cracks. She intended to keep looking for more. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind circling between memories of Peter and hopeful visions of a future with Julian that felt, for the first time, like something worth working toward, rather than a duty to simply endure. She did not know how much more her heart would be asked to give before this story reached its resolution, nor did she know that the peace she had found within these walls was already under threat from a danger approaching steadily from beyond the estate's gates. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by the usual post but by a messenger boy who refused to leave until it was placed directly into Eleanor's hands. She recognized the handwriting immediately, sharp and hurried, and her stomach dropped before she had even broken the seal. Colton Vane wrote with none of the courtesy her father's other creditors had shown. His words were blunt, almost threatening, demanding a sum far larger than the debt her mother had described in her earlier letter. He claimed additional interest had accrued, additional fees she did not understand, and he made it clear that if payment was not arranged within the fortnight, he intended to travel to Ashbourne Hall himself and make the matter known to the Duke directly. Eleanor read the letter 3 times in the privacy of her room, her hands growing colder with each pass. The sum Vane demanded was beyond anything she could raise alone, and the threat of his arrival at Ashbourne Hall filled her with a dread so complete she could barely think clearly enough to plan her next move. She could not tell Julian. That certainty had only grown stronger since the fragile warmth they had shared in the library days earlier. If he learned now that her family's debt remained unresolved, that his marriage had not in fact settled the transaction he believed complete, he would see it as deception, a betrayal of the trust that had only just begun to form between them. She could not risk destroying something so new and so precious over a truth she still believed she could manage alone. She spent the following days in careful thought, turning over every possibility in her mind. She had little of her own to sell, no independent wealth beyond what Julian provided, and she could not simply request funds from her husband without explaining why she needed them. But she remembered, with a flicker of hope, the small collection of jewelry her mother had given her before the wedding, pieces that had belonged to her grandmother, kept safe in a wooden box she had brought with her to Ashbourne Hall. It was not much, certainly not enough to cover the full sum Vane demanded, but it might buy her time, might convince him to wait a little longer while she found some other solution. It was the only plan she had, and desperation made it feel sufficient. She arranged, through careful and quiet inquiry, to meet a jeweler in the nearby village who dealt discreetly in such transactions, and on a gray afternoon while Julian was occupied with estate business, Eleanor slipped away from the house with the wooden box hidden beneath her cloak, telling only Agnes that she wished for a quiet walk to clear her thoughts. The village was a modest place, its streets narrow and lined with shops that had served the county for generations. Eleanor found the jeweler's establishment tucked between a bakery and a tailor's shop, and she stepped inside with her heart pounding, painfully aware of how far she had strayed from the sheltered life she had once known. The jeweler examined her grandmother's pieces with careful, appraising eyes, offering a sum that fell short of what she had hoped for but was better than nothing at all. Eleanor accepted the offer, her chest tight with grief at the loss of the last physical connection she carried to a grandmother she had loved dearly, and tucked the payment carefully into her cloak before leaving the shop. She had barely stepped back onto the street when a figure emerged from the shadow of a nearby doorway, and Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized Colton Vane himself, his expression sharp and calculating, clearly having anticipated her arrival in the village. "Duchess," he said, the title dripping with sarcasm, "how fortunate to find you here, and alone." "Mr. Vane," Eleanor said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coiling in her stomach, "you should not have come so far. I have your payment, though I fear it does not cover the full sum you demanded." "A partial payment," Vane said, his tone dismissive, "does not resolve a debt in full. I grow impatient, Duchess. Your father promised a resolution, and instead I have received excuses and delays. Perhaps it is time I made this matter known to your husband directly. I imagine His Grace would be quite interested to learn the truth of the transaction he believed settled." "Please," Eleanor said, her composure cracking despite her best efforts. "I am asking for time. I will find a way to pay the remainder, I swear it, but you must not go to my husband. It would destroy everything I have worked to build here." Vane's expression shifted into something almost pleased, as though her desperation confirmed some private satisfaction. "Everything has a price, Duchess. Perhaps we can arrange a more suitable timeline, if you are willing to make it worth my patience." The implication in his voice sent a fresh wave of fear through Eleanor, and she stepped back instinctively, putting distance between herself and the man before her. Before she could respond, however, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the tense standoff, and both Eleanor and Vane turned to see a familiar gray horse cutting swiftly down the village street. Julian dismounted before Winter had fully stopped, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. Eleanor pale and shaken, a stranger standing far too close for propriety, tension thick enough to cut in the air between them. "Eleanor," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "What is the meaning of this?" Vane, sensing the shift in power now that a duke stood before him, straightened his posture and offered a shallow, insincere bow. "Your Grace, I was simply discussing a matter of business with your wife, nothing more." "Business," Julian repeated, his gray eyes moving between Vane and Eleanor with growing suspicion. "What business would my wife have with a man I have never met?" Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she feared it might be visible beneath her cloak. She knew the moment had come, that whatever careful concealment she had managed until now was about to crumble entirely, and the fear of Julian's reaction nearly overwhelmed her ability to speak. "Your Grace," she began, her voice trembling, "I did not wish to burden you with matters that were mine alone to resolve." "Perhaps I should explain," Vane interrupted, a cruel satisfaction creeping into his voice. "Your wife's family owes a considerable debt, Your Grace, one that was only partially resolved by your marriage. I have come to collect what remains owed, and your Duchess has been attempting to settle the matter quietly, without your knowledge." Julian's expression darkened further, though whether from anger at Eleanor or at the man before him, Eleanor could not immediately tell. "Is this true?" he asked, turning to her directly, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened her more than open anger would have. "It is true," Eleanor admitted, tears gathering despite her effort to hold them back. "I did not know, when we married, that the full debt remained unpaid. I learned of it only after our wedding, and I did not wish to trouble you with a burden I believed I could resolve myself." For a long moment, Julian said nothing, his gaze fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her chest ache with fear and shame in equal measure. Then he turned to Vane, and when he spoke, his voice carried a coldness far more dangerous than Eleanor had ever heard from him before. "You will leave my wife alone," he said. "Whatever remains of this debt, you will address it through my solicitor, not through threats made against a woman walking alone in a public street. Do you understand me?" Vane's confidence faltered under the weight of Julian's authority, and he offered a hasty, stammering agreement before retreating quickly down the street, disappearing around a corner without a backward glance. Eleanor remained frozen in place, uncertain whether to feel relief at the confrontation's resolution, or dread at what would surely follow now that Julian knew the truth she had worked so hard to conceal. Julian turned to her, his expression unreadable, and for a long, silent moment neither of them spoke. Then, without a word, he extended his hand toward her, and Eleanor, uncertain of what else to do, took it, allowing him to help her onto Winter's back before mounting behind her and guiding the horse back toward Ashbourne Hall, in a silence heavy with everything left unsaid. The ride back felt endless, Eleanor's mind racing through every possible outcome, every version of anger or disappointment Julian might unleash once they reached the privacy of the house. She had kept a truth from him, a truth that touched directly on the foundation of their marriage, and she did not know if he would ever forgive the concealment, however well-intentioned it had been. When they arrived at Ashbourne Hall, Julian dismounted first and helped her down, his touch gentle despite the tension still evident in his jaw. He did not speak until they had reached the privacy of his study, and even then, he stood for a long moment in silence, his back to her, staring out the window at the grounds beyond. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than she expected, carrying more hurt than anger. "I was afraid," Eleanor admitted, the words spilling out before she could carefully measure them. "Afraid you would see me as a burden, as proof that this marriage was never the clean transaction you believed it to be. Afraid you would regret marrying me, knowing the truth of how deep my family's troubles truly ran." Julian turned to face her then, and the expression on his face was not the anger she had feared, but something far more complicated, grief and frustration, and something that looked, unmistakably, like concern. "Eleanor," he said, "I married you knowing your family faced difficulty. I did not marry you expecting perfection or a debt cleanly resolved. I married you because it was the arrangement offered to me, yes, but also because something in your composure that first day suggested a strength I found myself admiring, even then." Eleanor stared at him, stunned by the admission, unsure how to respond to a vulnerability so unlike anything he had shown her before. "I did not know you felt that way," she said softly. "I did not know it myself, fully, until this moment," Julian admitted. "But I find I am more troubled by your silence than by the debt itself. I would have helped you, Eleanor, had you simply told me the truth. Instead, you carried this burden alone, and today you placed yourself in danger rather than trust me with a truth I deserve to know." The words settled over Eleanor with the weight of both rebuke and something gentler, an invitation, perhaps, toward a kind of honesty she had not yet allowed herself within this marriage. "I am sorry," she said. "I have carried so many burdens alone for so long. I did not think to consider that I might not have to any longer." Julian crossed the room slowly, stopping before her, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You do not have to carry this alone," he said quietly. "Whatever remains of this debt, I will settle it in full. But I ask in return that you trust me with the truths that matter, going forward. I cannot protect what I do not know is threatened." Eleanor nodded, tears finally spilling free as the weight of weeks of hidden fear began to lift from her chest. "I will trust you," she said. "I promise." For a long moment, they simply stood together in the quiet study, closer than they had ever been, the careful distance that had defined their marriage finally beginning to dissolve into something that felt, for the first time, like the foundation of a true partnership. Eleanor did not know what challenges still lay ahead, whether Vane would honor Julian's demand or continue his threats through other means, but she understood now that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Later that evening, Julian summoned his solicitor by urgent letter, instructing the man to travel to Ashbourne Hall the following morning to begin arrangements for settling the remainder of the Whitfield debt. Eleanor watched him write the letter with steady, purposeful strokes, struck by how easily he moved to protect her once the truth stood plainly between them, when for weeks she had feared nothing but rejection at the very thought of confessing it. "You did not have to act so quickly," she said, watching him seal the letter with quiet efficiency. "I did," Julian replied, setting the letter aside and turning to face her fully. "A man like Vane grows bolder with delay. The sooner this matter is closed, the sooner you may set it aside entirely and stop carrying it as though it were still yours alone to bear." Eleanor lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, exhaustion from the day's events finally catching up with her. "I've spent so many months believing that protecting the people I love meant protecting them from knowing how much it cost me," she admitted. "I did not consider that keeping such secrets might cost me something as well. Trust, perhaps, or the chance to be helped rather than only ever helping." Julian studied her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "My mother used to say that a burden carried in silence grows heavier with every mile, while one shared, even partially, becomes lighter simply for having been spoken aloud. I did not understand the wisdom in that until tonight, watching you nearly break beneath a weight you refused to set down." "I am not accustomed to setting burdens down," Eleanor said softly. "I have carried them since I was young enough to understand what worry looked like on my mother's face." "Then perhaps," Julian said, "it is time you learned a different way of living, not as a duchess performing duty and not as a daughter shielding her family from every hardship alone, but as a woman permitted, finally, to share her troubles with someone willing to stand beside her." The words settled over Eleanor with quiet, unexpected comfort, and for the first time since her wedding day, she allowed herself to believe that the man she had married out of desperate necessity might yet become someone she could lean upon fully, without fear of judgment or rejection. She thanked him quietly, and though the events of the day had left her shaken, she retired that night with a lightness in her chest she had not felt in months, hopeful that the worst of Vane's threat had finally passed, unaware of how far the man's cruelty was still willing to reach. Colton Vane did not disappear quietly, despite Julian's warning, and within days a new threat arrived that neither Eleanor nor Julian had anticipated. A letter came to the solicitor handling the Whitfield debt, not from Vane directly, but from an associate of his claiming that the original sum had been miscalculated, and that additional documents, drafted with deliberately confusing language, suggested Eleanor's father owed a debt far larger than anyone had previously understood. Attached to the letter was a veiled threat, suggesting that if the full amended sum was not paid promptly, Vane intended to spread word through the county of the Whitfield family's disgrace, ensuring that even with the marriage to a duke, Eleanor's family name would be forever tainted by scandal and rumor. Julian read the letter in his study with Eleanor standing beside him, her hands clenched tightly at her sides as she watched his expression harden with each line. "This is extortion," Julian said finally, setting the letter down with controlled fury. "He seeks to bleed us for whatever he believes he can extract, using your family's reputation as leverage." "What can we do?" Eleanor asked, fear creeping back into her voice despite the promise of partnership Julian had offered days earlier. "We will fight it properly," Julian said. "I will not be threatened into paying an inflated sum, simply because a desperate man believes wealth makes me an easy target. My solicitor will examine every document Vane has produced, And if fraud is present in his claims, as I suspect it is, we will expose it rather than surrender to it. The days that followed passed in tense preparation. Julian's solicitor, a sharp and meticulous man named Frederick Lowe, arrived at Ashbourne Hall and spent long hours reviewing every document related to the original debt, comparing figures, examining signatures, and slowly uncovering evidence that Vane had indeed altered the original sum, forging additional interest that had never been agreed upon by Eleanor's father. Eleanor found herself drawn into the process more than she expected, sitting with Julian and Lowe in the study during long evenings, offering what details she could recall of her father's original arrangement, watching as the picture of Vane's deception grew clearer with each passing day. Through these long hours of shared purpose, something shifted more deeply between Eleanor and Julian than either had anticipated. He began seeking her opinion on matters beyond the immediate crisis, valuing her insight in ways that surprised her, and she found herself admiring the quiet determination with which he fought not out of pride, but out of genuine care for her family's well-being. One evening, as Lowe departed for the night and the study grew quiet around them, Julian looked up from the papers spread across his desk and studied Eleanor with an expression she had not seen from him before, something open and unguarded. "I find myself grateful," he said quietly, "that circumstances brought you into my life, however difficult the path that led us here." Eleanor's heart quickened at the admission. "Even knowing everything you now know? The debt, the deception, the burden my family has placed upon this house? Especially knowing everything," Julian said. "You have shown a strength these past weeks that I did not expect to find in anyone, let alone a wife I married as a matter of practical necessity. You faced Vane alone in that village street rather than allow your family's shame to touch this house. You have sat through these long evenings offering clarity, when the rest of us grew lost in confusion. I did not marry a burden, Eleanor. I married a woman of remarkable resolve." The warmth in his voice, so unlike the cold formality of their first weeks together, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, and she found herself crossing the small distance between them without fully deciding to do so, drawn by an instinct she no longer wished to resist. "Julian," she said softly, using his given name with a tenderness she had not allowed herself before, "I must tell you something, and I ask that you hear it fully before you respond." He watched her with quiet attention, waiting. "When I agreed to this marriage, I believed I was sacrificing any hope of happiness for myself in exchange for my family's safety," she continued. "I expected coldness. I expected distance. I did not expect to find, within these walls, a man capable of such quiet kindness, beneath the reputation the world has given him. I do not know precisely when it happened, but I find that my heart has changed course entirely from where it began. I care for you, Julian, deeply, not out of obligation but because of who you truly are." For a long moment, Julian said nothing, his gray eyes searching her face, as though verifying the truth of her words before allowing himself to believe them. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand in his touch gentle in a way that spoke more clearly than any words could have. "I have spent years believing that loving deeply only invites devastating loss," he said quietly. "I built walls around my heart after my mother passed, and after losing someone I once believed I would spend my life beside. I told myself that distance was safety, that coldness protected me from ever feeling such grief again. But these past weeks with you have shown me the cost of that safety, Eleanor. I have been alone in a house that could have held warmth, simply because I feared what warmth might cost me if I lost it." "You do not have to fear losing me," Eleanor said softly, tears spilling freely now. "I know that, in my mind," Julian admitted, "but teaching my heart to believe it fully will take time. I ask for your patience, as I have asked nothing else of you since this marriage began." "You have it," Eleanor said, "for as long as you need it." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, and the gesture, simple as it was, carried more warmth than any grand declaration could have offered. It was, Eleanor understood, the beginning of something neither of them had expected when this marriage was first arranged out of desperate necessity, a fragile trust growing into something that felt, increasingly, like genuine devotion. But even as their bond deepened, Vane's threat remained unresolved, and within the week, Lowe returned with news that changed the shape of the danger entirely. The solicitor had uncovered clear evidence of fraud in Vane's amended documents, forged signatures and altered figures that would not withstand legal scrutiny. Armed with this evidence, Julian intended to confront Vane directly, not through quiet negotiation, but through the full weight of legal consequence. "He will not walk away easily," Lowe warned. "Men like Vane rarely surrender without a fight, particularly when exposure threatens more than his profit. He may attempt one final act of desperation before accepting defeat. Julian's expression hardened with resolve. Let him try. I have faced greater threats than a desperate merchant's schemes. Whatever he attempts, I will not allow him to touch my wife or her family again. Eleanor watched her husband with growing admiration, understanding now the depth of the devotion hidden beneath the reputation the world had given him. He was not the cold, cruel duke rumor had described. He was a man who had learned, slowly and carefully, to open his heart again, and who now stood ready to defend that heart, and the woman who had claimed it, against any threat that dared approach. That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since her wedding day, to imagine a future at Ashbourne Hall, built not on obligation, but on genuine partnership and love. She thought of Peter only briefly, with quiet gratitude for the tenderness he had once shown her rather than lingering grief, understanding now that the path her life had taken, however difficult its beginning, had led her somewhere she was grateful, finally, to call home. But Lowe's warning lingered in her mind as she drifted towards sleep, a quiet unease that Vane's desperation might yet produce one final, dangerous act before this chapter of her life reached its true resolution. She did not yet know how right that unease would prove to be, nor how close the coming days would bring her family, and her fragile new happiness, to true and lasting danger. The following morning brought word that Vane had left the county entirely, retreating in the face of Julian's legal preparations, and for a brief, hopeful moment, Eleanor believed the danger had finally passed. She spent that day in the garden with Julian, the first truly peaceful afternoon they had shared since her arrival at Ashbourne Hall. He showed her the roses his mother had planted decades earlier, still tended carefully by the household staff, and told her stories of his childhood she had never imagined he would share. Tales of climbing the old oak near the eastern wall, of racing Winter's mother across the fields until his own father scolded him for recklessness. Eleanor listened with quiet delight, cherishing every fragment of the man he had been before grief taught him to guard himself so completely. I had forgotten how much I loved this garden, Julian admitted, running his fingers along the petals of a deep red rose. I stopped walking here after my mother passed. It felt easier to avoid the memory than to face it. And now? Eleanor asked. Now I find I would rather remember her here, with you beside me, than continue avoiding a place that once brought me such happiness, he said, and the honesty in his voice warmed her more thoroughly than the afternoon sun. They walked together through the rows of flowers, and for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor allowed herself to laugh freely, to tease him gently about his stern reputation among the household staff, to watch the corners of his mouth lift into something that resembled, unmistakably, genuine happiness. It was a small thing, an ordinary afternoon in a garden, yet it felt to Eleanor like the truest gift she had received since arriving at Ashbourne Hall, proof that the walls between them had finally begun to fall away entirely. That evening, over a dinner far warmer than any they had shared before, Julian spoke of plans for the estate, of improvements he wished to make to the tenant cottages, of a school he hoped to establish for the children of the village. Eleanor listened with growing admiration, understanding that the coldness he had shown the world was never the whole truth of who he was, but rather a shield he had carried out of necessity, one he was finally learning to set aside in her presence. You care deeply for the people who depend upon this estate, she observed. I learned that from my father, before his own health declined, Julian said. He believed a title carried responsibility as much as privilege. I lost sight of that, somewhat, in the years after my losses. I find myself remembering it more clearly now. Because of the garden? Eleanor asked, smiling. Because of you, Julian said simply, and the quiet sincerity in his voice left her momentarily speechless. Later that night, as they sat together in the library among his mother's collection of poetry, Julian read aloud to her from a worn volume, his voice low and steady in the candlelit room. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at peace. Whatever hardship had brought her to this house, whatever fear still lingered at the edges of her heart regarding Vane and the debt that had nearly destroyed everything, she found herself grateful, deeply and completely, for the path that had led her here. She should have known better than to trust such quiet so completely. Men like Vane did not simply disappear when cornered. They regrouped, and waited, and searched for weaknesses they had not yet exploited, and Eleanor would soon learn that the greatest test of her new happiness with Julian was still to come, arriving from a direction she had never thought to guard against. A letter arrived 3 days later, addressed not to Julian, but to Peter Grant, forwarded to Ashbourne Hall by mistake through a clerical error at the village post office. Eleanor recognized the handwriting on the outer seal as Vane's own, and though she knew opening a letter addressed to another was a betrayal of trust, fear for what it might contain overcame her hesitation entirely. The contents chilled her far more than she expected. Vane had written to Peter directly, offering him information about Eleanor's circumstances in exchange for his cooperation in a scheme designed to embarrass Julian publicly and force a larger settlement through scandal rather than legal means. Vane believed, correctly, that Peter's lingering feelings for Eleanor might be exploited, used as leverage to draw him into a plot that could unravel everything she and Julian had begun to build together. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the letter a second time, understanding now the full extent of Vane's desperation and the danger that still threatened her family and her marriage, despite his apparent retreat from the county. She knew, with sudden and complete certainty, that she could not face this final threat in silence, not after everything she and Julian had built in recent weeks. Whatever came next, they would face it together, honestly, as the partnership they were only just beginning to become. She found Julian in his study that evening and placed the letter before him without hesitation, explaining the clerical error that had brought it into her hands, and watching as his expression darkened with each line he read. "He seeks to use Peter against us," Julian said quietly, setting the letter down with controlled anger. "A final, desperate attempt to salvage whatever profit he believes he is owed." "I do not believe Peter will cooperate," Eleanor said. "Whatever pain I caused him, he is not a man who would seek to harm me through deception." "I hope you are right," Julian said, "but we cannot leave the matter to hope alone. I will write to him directly, and to the magistrate as well. Vane has crossed a line tonight that leaves no room for further patience. He will answer for this fully." Eleanor watched her husband with quiet gratitude, understanding that whatever fear this final threat carried, she no longer faced it as a woman alone, hiding truths out of shame or desperation. She faced it now beside a partner who had proven, time and again in recent weeks, that his devotion to her ran far deeper than obligation ever could. Peter Grant arrived at Ashbourne Hall for the second time within a month, though this visit carried none of the tension of the first. He came at Julian's written invitation, and when he entered the study where Eleanor and Julian waited together, his expression carried none of the desperate hope Eleanor had feared, only quiet resolve and a determination to set matters right. "I received Vane's letter as well," Peter said without preamble, producing a folded paper from his coat. "I want you both to know that I refused his offer the moment I understood what he intended. Whatever remains between Eleanor and myself, it is not something I would ever use as a weapon against her happiness." Julian studied the young man for a long moment, something like respect settling into his gray eyes. "I am grateful for your honesty," he said, "and for your restraint, given the circumstances." "I loved her once," Peter said simply, glancing toward Eleanor with quiet sincerity rather than lingering longing. "I still care for her well-being, deeply, but I have come to understand, seeing you both together even briefly during my last visit, that whatever future she has found here is one I have no wish to disturb. I came today only to ensure Vane's scheme found no foothold through me." Eleanor felt tears gathering as she listened to Peter's words, grateful beyond measure for the grace he offered in a moment that could have easily turned toward bitterness instead. "Thank you, Peter," she said softly, "for everything. For understanding, even now, what I could not fully explain when I ended our understanding all those months ago." "I understand now," Peter said. "I did not, at first. But watching you here, I see the truth of what your sacrifice accomplished, and the happiness it seems to have brought you in return. I wish you both well, truly." He took his leave shortly after, and with his testimony added to the evidence Lowe had already gathered, Julian's case against Vane grew strong enough to bring the matter before the local magistrate within the week. Vane, faced with clear evidence of fraud and coercion, along with testimony from multiple witnesses, chose to settle rather than face the full consequence of formal charges, returning what remained of the original debt and agreeing never to trouble the Whitfield family again. The relief that settled over Eleanor when the matter finally concluded felt almost overwhelming, a weight lifted that she had carried, in some form, since that terrible midnight when her father first delivered news of the family's ruin. She wrote to her mother immediately, sharing the news, and received in return a letter so full of joy and gratitude that Eleanor found herself weeping over the pages, finally allowing herself to feel the full relief of a danger truly and completely past. Before the celebration could begin, however, one final complication arose that tested the strength of everything Eleanor and Julian had built together. Vane, though he had agreed to settle the debt before the magistrate, sent one last bitter letter to several prominent families in the county, hinting darkly that the Duke's marriage had been built upon deception and hidden scandal, hoping even in defeat to plant seeds of doubt that might tarnish Eleanor's standing among her new peers. Word of the letter reached Julian through Lady Cordelia, who arrived at Ashbourne Hall 2 days before the planned celebration, with the offending pages clutched in her gloved hand and worry etched across her face. "This cannot go unanswered," Cordelia said, pacing the length of the drawing room while Eleanor and Julian read the letter together. "Vane may have lost his case before the magistrate, but gossip does not require legal proof to do its damage. If this reaches the wrong ears before the gathering, it could shadow the evening entirely." Eleanor felt the old fear rising in her chest, the instinct to retreat, to hide, to shoulder the burden quietly rather than risk further exposure. But she caught herself this time, remembering the promise she had made to Julian weeks earlier in his study, and instead of retreating into silence, she spoke plainly. "Then we do not hide from it," she said. "We answer it openly, before the gathering, so that no whisper Vane sends ahead of us can shape the evening instead of the truth itself." Julian looked at her with quiet pride, the same admiration she had seen in his eyes the night he first confessed his growing feelings for her. "What do you propose?" "Let Lady Cordelia's invitation stand as it is," Eleanor said, "but allow me to speak with the families most likely to have heard Vane's claims before the evening begins, and address the truth directly, rather than let rumor arrive first. I am done hiding behind fear of what others might think, Julian. I would rather face this honestly, at your side, than spend another single day guarding a truth that no longer needs guarding." Cordelia's expression shifted from worry to something like admiration of her own. "Spoken like a true duchess," she said, a small smile finally breaking through her concern. "Very well. I will arrange introductions before the evening's festivities begin in earnest." In the 2 days that followed, Eleanor called personally upon several of the county's most influential families, speaking with quiet dignity about the debt her father had incurred, the marriage that had followed, and the genuine devotion that had grown between herself and Julian in the months since. She did not plead for sympathy, nor did she offer excuses. She simply told the truth, plainly and with quiet confidence, and found, to her relief, that most of her listeners responded not with judgment, but with respect for her candor. By the time the evening of the celebration finally arrived, Vane's bitter letter had lost whatever power it might have held, rendered harmless by Eleanor's own honesty and the genuine warmth she and Julian now shared openly before anyone who cared to observe it. But even as one threat resolved, Eleanor understood that a different kind of reckoning remained ahead, one that required not legal resolution but honest declaration, before her family, before Julian's peers, before the county that had watched their marriage begin as a cold transaction, and had whispered ever since about its true nature. Julian's aunt, Lady Cordelia Ashbourne, arranged a grand gathering at Ashbourne Hall to celebrate the resolution of the family's troubles, though Eleanor suspected the true purpose ran deeper, an opportunity for the county to finally witness whether the Duke's marriage had produced genuine happiness or merely continued obligation. Eleanor prepared for the evening with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy, aware that whatever she said and did that night would shape the county's understanding of her marriage for years to come. The evening arrived with all the grandeur Ashbourne Hall could offer, candlelight glowing warmly through every window, music drifting from the ballroom, guests arriving in carriages that lined the long drive in elegant procession. Eleanor descended the staircase in a gown of deep blue silk, and when she found Julian waiting at the bottom, his gray eyes lit with open admiration rather than careful distance, her heart swelled with a happiness she had never imagined possible when this marriage first began. "You look radiant," Julian said, offering his arm. "I feel radiant," Eleanor admitted, "for the first time in longer than I can remember." The evening unfolded with warmth Eleanor had not expected, guests offering genuine congratulations rather than curious speculation, the county's earlier whispers giving way to admiration for the clear devotion between the Duke and his young Duchess. Eleanor moved through the gathering with growing confidence, no longer the frightened bride who had arrived at Ashbourne Hall months earlier, but a woman secure in her place, in her marriage, and in the love that had grown between herself and the man beside her. It was during a quiet moment on the terrace, away from the noise of the celebration, that Julian took her hand and spoke words she had not expected, though she had hoped for them in her quietest, most private moments. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had come to treasure in the months since their marriage began. "I did not marry you for love. I married you out of necessity, as you married me. But somewhere in the months since, watching your strength, your kindness, your willingness to fight for everyone you love, even at great cost to yourself, I find that necessity has transformed into something far deeper than I ever believed myself capable of feeling again." Eleanor's breath caught, tears gathering as she waited for him to continue. "I love you," Julian said simply, not out of obligation, not out of the arrangement that first brought us together, but because you are precisely the woman I did not know I needed until you arrived at my door, carrying more courage than I had seen in years. I do not know what I did to deserve such devotion, but I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of it. You have already proven it, Eleanor said softly, tears spilling freely now. Every day since Vane's threat, every quiet kindness, every moment you chose partnership over pride. I love you too, Julian. Completely. Not the Duke the county whispers about, but the man I have come to know beneath that reputation, gentle and devoted, and far braver than he believes himself to be. Julian drew her close, and beneath the soft glow of moonlight on the terrace, he kissed her gently. A kiss that carried none of the cold formality of their wedding day, only the genuine devotion of two people who had found, against every expectation, a love neither had believed themselves capable of after everything life had asked them to sacrifice. When they returned to the celebration, hand in hand, the county saw plainly what had grown between them, and the whispers that had once questioned the nature of their marriage transformed instead into quiet admiration for a love story that had begun in desperation and blossomed, against all odds, into something genuine and lasting. Julian led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began a slow, graceful waltz, and Eleanor found herself laughing softly as he guided her through the steps with far more skill than she had expected from a man so often described as guarded and severe. The guests around them formed a loose circle, watching with open admiration as the Duke and his Duchess moved together, with an ease that spoke plainly of genuine affection rather than practiced obligation. You dance far better than your reputation suggests, Eleanor teased, her hand resting easily in his. I had little reason to dance in recent years, Julian admitted, spinning her gently beneath the chandelier's warm light. You have given me reason enough to remember how. Lady Cordelia watched from the edge of the room with visible satisfaction, leaning toward one of the county's most notorious gossips to remark, loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, that she had never seen her nephew so thoroughly and openly content. The word spread quickly through the gathering, and by the time the waltz concluded, whatever lingering doubt Vane's bitter letter might have planted had withered entirely beneath the plain evidence of the couple's happiness. Eleanor's mother approached during a quiet lull in the music, tears of joy shining in her eyes as she embraced her daughter warmly. I feared, when you agreed to this marriage, that I had asked too great a sacrifice of you, she admitted quietly. Seeing you now, I understand that whatever fear guided your decision that night, your heart found its way to something true regardless. I am so very proud of you, Eleanor. You did not ask this sacrifice of me, Mother, Eleanor said gently. I chose it, freely, because I could not imagine a world where I did not try to protect this family. I do not regret a single moment of that choice, not now, not ever. As the evening wound toward its close and guests began departing in a steady procession of carriages down the long gravel drive, Julian drew Eleanor aside once more, this time toward the quiet warmth of the library where their fragile connection had first begun to take root months earlier. I have one final matter to settle tonight, he said, producing a small wooden box from within his coat, similar in shape to the one that had once held her grandmother's jewelry, the pieces she had sacrificed to buy time against Vane's threats. Eleanor's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate necklace, simple and elegant, clearly chosen with careful thought rather than mere extravagance. I learned of the pieces you sold to protect your family, Julian said quietly. I could not restore precisely what was lost, but I hope this might serve as a small token of everything you have given, and everything I intend to give in return, for the rest of our lives together. Eleanor's tears returned as he fastened the necklace gently around her throat, his fingers lingering warmly against her skin. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me, truly, and for choosing to love the woman you found beneath the duty that first brought us together. I did not choose it so much as I discovered it. Slowly and completely, Julian said, drawing her into his arms once more. You saved your family the night you agreed to marry me, Eleanor. But somewhere along the way, without either of us intending it, you saved me as well. Eleanor's family joined the celebration as honored guests rather than desperate supplicants, her mother radiant with relief, Charlotte delighted by the grandeur of the evening, Henry thoroughly pleased to finally see the library he had asked about so long ago. Her father, humbled by everything his daughter's sacrifice had accomplished, thanked Julian privately during the evening, and Eleanor watched from across the room as the two men shook hands, a quiet reconciliation that closed the final chapter of the crisis that had once threatened to destroy everything her family held dear. As the celebration continued long into the night, Eleanor found herself standing once more beside Julian, near the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. The same gardens where he had shared stories of his childhood weeks earlier, where the walls between them had first begun to truly fall away. "Do you regret it?" Julian asked quietly. "The sacrifice you made, agreeing to marry a stranger to save your family?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, thinking back over every difficult moment since that terrible midnight when her father first delivered news of the family's ruin, every fear, every hidden truth, every quiet victory that had brought her finally to this moment of genuine happiness. "I do not regret it," she said finally. "I gave up a future I once believed I wanted, for a family I love beyond measure, and in return, I found a future I did not know to hope for, with a man I have come to love more deeply than I believed possible. Every sacrifice led me here, Julian, to this moment, to this life. I would not change a single step of the path that brought me to you." Julian pulled her close, resting his forehead gently against hers, and in the quiet warmth of that embrace, Eleanor understood that every sacrifice she had made, every secret she had carried alone, every fear she had faced in silence, had finally found its true and complete resolution. She had married a stranger to save her family, and in doing so, had found a love she would treasure for the rest of her life, proof that even the coldest beginnings could grow, with patience and honesty and courage, into something genuinely and lastingly warm. The music continued softly from the ballroom behind them, and beneath the stars scattered across the clear night sky, Eleanor and Julian remained together on the terrace, no longer a duke and duchess bound by cold obligation, but two people who had found, against every expectation life had offered them, a partnership built on genuine devotion, honesty, and a love that neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding again. Spring arrived at Ashbourne Hall with a warmth the estate had not known in many years, and Eleanor stood at the nursery window one morning, watching the gardeners prepare the beds where Julian's mother had once planted roses, feeling a quiet contentment settle over her that she had never imagined possible during those first cold weeks of her marriage. A full year had passed since the celebration that marked the end of Vane's threats, and much had changed within the walls of Ashbourne Hall in that time. Julian had made good on his promise to establish a school for the village children, and Eleanor spent many mornings there herself, teaching young girls to read alongside the modest staff he had hired, finding purpose in work that extended far beyond the duties of a duchess managing household accounts. Her family visited often now, welcomed warmly rather than tolerated out of obligation. Charlotte had grown into a poised young woman, her education flourishing under tutors Julian had generously provided, and Henry, now 13, had become a frequent visitor to the library, working his way steadily through the very poetry collection that had first drawn Eleanor and Julian together in those uncertain early days. Peter Grant had married within the year as well, a kind woman from a neighboring county, and he wrote to Eleanor occasionally, friendly letters free of any lingering sorrow, filled instead with news of his own growing happiness. Eleanor read his letters with genuine warmth, grateful that the pain of their parting had softened into something resembling true friendship, unburdened finally by regret on either side. Colton Vane's name had not surfaced again since his defeat before the magistrate, though Eleanor heard occasionally through distant acquaintances that his business dealings had suffered considerably in the wake of the scandal his own fraud had created. She felt no satisfaction in his misfortune, only relief that the shadow he had once cast over her family had lifted entirely, replaced now by nothing but quiet, ordinary peace. Julian had changed most remarkably of all, though Eleanor suspected he would insist the transformation belonged equally to them both. The cold formality that had once defined him had softened into an easy warmth the household staff remarked upon frequently, grateful to see their master restored to something resembling the joyful young man he had been before tragedy first claimed his heart. He laughed more freely now, teased her gently over breakfast in place of silent newspapers, and spent long evenings reading aloud from his mother's poetry collection, his voice steady and full of quiet contentment. On a warm afternoon in early June, Julian found her in the garden among the roses, and something in his expression told her immediately that he carried news of importance. "I have received a letter from the magistrate's office," he said, settling beside her on the stone bench that overlooked the eastern fields. "It seems Vane's earlier fraud has drawn the attention of authorities beyond our county. He faces further consequence now for schemes practiced against other families, entirely unrelated to our own troubles. I hope those families find the same resolution we did," Eleanor said quietly, and meant it fully. "As do I," Julian agreed. "Though I confess, some part of me finds satisfaction in knowing that a man who sought to profit from desperation has finally faced consequence for the harm he caused so many." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder. watching the afternoon light filter gently through the rose bushes his mother had planted so many years before. Do you ever think of how differently our lives might have unfolded had my father never fallen into debt, had we never been forced into this arrangement at all? Julian considered the question thoughtfully before answering. I have thought of it, occasionally, he admitted, but I find I cannot truly wish it away, however difficult its beginning. That desperate arrangement brought you to me, Eleanor, and I do not believe I would have found my way back to happiness without you. Perhaps some paths, however painful their start, lead exactly where they are meant to. I believe that too, Eleanor said softly. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while. The estate spread peacefully around them, the household staff moving quietly about their duties in the distance. The whole of Ashbourne Hall settled finally into the warm, genuine happiness that had once seemed impossible within its cold stone walls. That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, Julian raised his glass in a small, private toast, meant only for the two of them despite the presence of the staff moving quietly about the dining room. To the woman who married a stranger to save her family, he said, and in doing so, saved a man who had long forgotten how to hope for happiness of his own. Eleanor raised her glass in return, tears of quiet joy gathering in her eyes. To the Duke the world called cruel, she said, who turned out to be the gentlest, most devoted man I have ever known. They drank together beneath the soft candlelight, and Eleanor found herself thinking, not for the first time, of that terrible midnight so many months earlier, when her father's shaking hands had delivered news of the family's ruin. She had believed, in that moment, that she was sacrificing every hope of happiness for herself in exchange for her family's survival. She understood now, with the clarity that only time and genuine love could offer, that she had lost nothing that truly mattered that night. She had only been walking, slowly and uncertainly, toward the life she was always meant to find. The rose garden bloomed fully that summer, more vibrant than the household staff could remember in years, and visitors to Ashbourne Hall often remarked upon the warmth that had settled over the estate, a warmth entirely absent during the years of quiet grief that had preceded Eleanor's arrival. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne became known throughout the county not for coldness or scandal, but for genuine devotion, for the quiet kindness they extended to tenants and villagers alike, for a partnership built upon honesty and mutual respect rather than mere obligation. Eleanor often walked alone through the library in quiet moments, running her fingers along the spines of poetry that had once belonged to a mother-in-law she had never known but had come, through Julian's memories, to feel a quiet kinship with regardless. She understood now the full weight of what those books represented, not merely grief preserved on a shelf, but love that had endured, patiently waiting for someone willing to help carry it forward, into a new generation of warmth and belonging. Her own sacrifice, once so painful to carry alone, had transformed over the months into something she viewed, not with regret, but with quiet gratitude. She had given up a simple future with Peter, yes, but in its place she had found a life richer and more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. A marriage built first on necessity and desperation, but grown, through patience and honesty and genuine effort, into something she treasured completely. As autumn approached once more, bringing with it the anniversary of that first cold wedding day at Ashbourne Hall, Eleanor stood again at the nursery window, watching the leaves begin their slow transformation across the estate's vast grounds. Julian joined her there, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind, resting his chin softly against her shoulder as they watched the changing season together. 1 year, he murmured. It feels both longer and shorter than I can properly account for. It feels, Eleanor said, leaning into his embrace, like the beginning of everything that truly matters. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees that had once seemed so cold and unfamiliar to her, and Eleanor understood, standing there in the warmth of her husband's embrace, that she had found not merely safety within these walls, but a home, a partnership, and a love that no desperate midnight arrangement could have promised, yet had somehow, against every expectation, delivered in full. That evening, Mrs. Bramwell found Eleanor in the corridor outside the nursery and paused, a soft smile crossing her weathered face. You have brought such life back into this house, my lady, she said. I confess I did not believe it possible, that first night you arrived so frightened and uncertain. Watching you and His Grace now, I find myself grateful every single day for whatever fortune brought you through our doors. It was not fortune alone, Eleanor said gently. It was patience, and honesty, and a willingness on both our parts to set aside old fears in favor of something better. I am grateful for it too, Mrs. Bramwell. More than I can properly express. The housekeeper nodded warmly and continued on her way, and Eleanor lingered a moment longer, thinking of the many small kindnesses that had carried her through those difficult early weeks, the quiet wisdom Mrs. Bramwell had offered when Eleanor understood so little of the man she had married. She resolved, in that quiet moment, to ensure that Ashbourne Hall remained always a place of warmth and welcome, not only for herself and Julian, but for every soul who called it home. In the years that followed, though this particular chapter of her story had reached its close, Eleanor often found herself reflecting on the lessons that midnight of desperation had taught her. She had learned that love built on honesty, however painful the truths it required, proved far stronger than any arrangement built on silence and hidden fear. She had learned that courage did not always announce itself loudly, but sometimes arrived quietly, in the simple decision to trust another person with one's truest self. She taught these lessons, in time, to her own children, who grew up running through the same gardens their father once wandered as a boy, filling Ashbourne Hall with laughter that echoed through corridors that had once known only silence and grief. Julian watched his children with the same quiet wonder he had once reserved for his mother's poetry, marveling often that a house so long shadowed by loss had become, through Eleanor's patient love, a place of such enduring joy. And on quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the candles burned low in the library among the poetry that had first drawn husband and wife together, Eleanor would sometimes catch Julian watching her with the same expression he had worn on their wedding night, though transformed entirely from cold formality into something warm and grateful and endlessly devoted. She understood, in those quiet moments, that whatever she had sacrificed on that terrible midnight so long ago, she had received in return a life beyond anything she could have imagined possible, a love that had grown slowly and honestly from the coldest of beginnings into something that would last, she believed with quiet certainty, for the whole of their days together.